better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice.
Howdy, Rob.
Hello, Matt.
I was thinking about what's the hierarchy of nerd activity. You know, you can play a game of apples to apples with your friends. That's okay. Somewhere below that is convincing them to play a game of Dungeons and Dragons with you. But what's below that? What is looked upon as less or spit upon by the masses even more than playing a TTRPG?
I know where you're going with this. I remember seeing ages ago sort of like a hierarchy of nerds, and like at the very top was like published science fiction authors, right? That's the most respectable type of nerd that you can be, and then
I agree. You're reading the Three-Body Problem. You're okay, right?
You're okay.
You're accepted in polite society.
That's right. Down near the bottom as you play D&D, and I think like at the very bottom was like live action role play and miniature wargaming. Like your Vampire the Masquerade in a convention center, and your Warhammer 40K armies set up on a gigantic table. There is no lower form of nerd than those, according to society.
And we reject society's conventions here because we love all of these things. We love weird board games, we love LARPs, and we love miniature wargaming. And so this may be the first episode in a intermittent series on maybe do something else with your friends if you can't make a TTRPG happen. But are there other games that kind of capture that feeling?
Yeah, and this is interesting. We have alluded to a bunch of this stuff, and Matt and I both together and separately play a bunch of games that are similar in feel and in execution to an actual TTRPG, but are technically either board games or tactical war games of some kind. And this is great because you don't usually need a DM. And it's often, but not always, easier to set up and start playing these games. And that makes it a good option, if you cannot get your friends together, which happens more and more often as you get old.
Yeah, so today we want to focus on what I'm calling the Renaissance, revival, revolution in narrative miniatures gaming, or narrative war games. These are things where you usually have like some terrain on a table, or it could even be drawn on your hex or a square mat, or it could just be a bunch of like books and soda cans, and you probably have some miniatures either made out of like paper standees or actual like plastic or metal painted. And these can be a lot of fun. And I think when you probably think about these, you're thinking of, the classics. You're thinking of Little Wars. You're thinking of people with Napoleonic regiments or tanks from World War II moving around.
Literal
and those are fun.
Soldiers, figurines from
yes.
Those ancient Napoleonic board games, which are still cool. Those are fun if you can ever find one at like a rubbish sale or something. They are. The rules are insane and complicated, but it's still kind of fun to play those Napoleonic setups. But Matt has a lot more experience with this than I do, but there's a lot of these that I have played and are fun. And I think what's neat is that there's not, and Matt, let me know if you
sure.
agree with this, but like I think there's not a clear delineation. Like I just had a thought. Like what makes it a tabletop RPG? Like does it require a game master or game master like character, or is there something else? I guess the thing that I'm thinking about is there's a spectrum, right? You have everything from like full on, rulers and tape and 100-page rule book wargaming, and any narrative you create is your own, all the way up to something like, for example, Star Wars Imperial Assault or Shadows of Brimstone, where there is an evolving campaign, but the core gameplay is a tactical war game. There's terrain, there's miniatures, that sort of thing. And there's kind of everything in between.
Yeah, so I would say that basically any type of miniatures game or miniatures wargaming is all narrative to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you just want to play a pure competitive game, you would probably play something like chess.
Right.
But if you have these miniatures you've painted or something like that, they probably have some symbolic value or story, right? They represent the Rebel Alliance or the Ultramarine chapter of Space Marines, right? Or Space Orcs or something like that. And you're constructing some narrative when you have this. But on that spectrum, I think wargaming has kind of evolved where a lot of people are, wargaming is very popular. The leading company, Games Workshop, is so rich that they're even in their, benevolent capitalist ways, giving like kickbacks to their employees out of their profits. They're making so much money. But a lot of people who play those games, right, play it in kind of a competitive way, right? They go to tournaments. They're interested in the balance and the rules and which army is the best in the meta right now. And that's all fine if you're into that. But, we like stories and creating stories. And narrative wargaming is like a great way to create a story, just like in a TTRPG. Now, you might not be like acting out your mini characters, but like you are telling a story, you're seeing what happens, you're playing to find out, and that part of the role-playing game experience can be beautifully captured by a narrative miniatures gaming system. And we're going to tell you about some of them today.
And I've talked about this a lot. I really like, in lots of ways, the kind of things that emerge from a narrative war game, a tactical war game, emergent gameplay, the things that sort of like happen to your crew or your team, things emerging over time, the randomness, adapting to circumstances. This is the whole thing I love about XCOM, which is essentially a like perfectly designed CRPG that's just a tactical war game with lots of bells and whistles. And this is I think, like Matt is suggesting, there's a lot to be learned from these types of games, and a lot that echoes and plays well with like what you are experiencing in a TTRPG.
If a TTRPG is Baldur's Gate or Knights of the Old Republic or Fallout, where you're role-playing one character, then narrative miniature wargaming is XCOM, just as Rob described it, right? It's tactical. There's still a story. You don't have a character. You probably have a small group of characters, though some of the ones we're going to talk about are going to break that rule. And they can be really fun. I think the great advantage is if you have like other hobby time, if you enjoy creating terrain and miniatures on your own time, this is great. If you want to do something to create a story to keep your creative juices flowing by yourself, many of these that we're going to talk about can be played solo or with a much smaller group of people, like with 2 or 3, which are numbers that you can play a TTRPG with, right? 2 or 3 people total. But we've talked about it before. Ideally, you might want a few more people than that for a tabletop role-playing game. But with a narrative miniatures game, 2 might be the ideal number, right? Or 3. So that's another advantage we've got here.
I want to take a step back. I was looking for this quote and I couldn't find it, but Matt and I have been doing some other investigation, and I was reading the rulebook for Strategos, a war game that was published in 1880. And as you all know, this predates tabletop by almost 100 years. But the person who adjudicates how it goes in Strategos is called the referee. And listen to this bit about the referee, because I really like this, and I think that it demonstrates, I think, what is interesting about wargaming and how I think the sort of like the narrative function is a little bit fuzzier than you might think. So the office of the referee should be regarded not so much in the light of an advisor as an arbiter. He should bear in mind the principle that anything can be attempted. The advisability of an attempt is another thing, and that is the object of the wargame to make evident to all concerned by results. The referee, therefore, should generally require a positive statement of intention as the basis of his decision. The attempt must be willed into operation by the player.
That's so perfect. And one of the things, and so I think Rob's point of this quote from like the Victorian era is great in that many narrative role-playing or narrative miniature games have moved back to this kind of idea, like where rules are looser, they're simpler, they have some general advice on how to do things. Whereas if you've played, let's say, 10th edition Warhammer 40K, you can't be like, actually, I'm sending infiltrators into the opponent's army ahead of the battle, or my soldiers are climbing up in the trees to shoot down at them. You can't do that. That's not it. You know, the rules are very prescribed in what they can do. And many of the things we're going to talk about, where if you wanted to will anything into existence, even if it's maybe not the best strategy, you can do it, right? There's a rule for that in these new narrative revival systems.
And most games have more prescribed rules, and you can't just do whatever you want. But I think this quote, and I think wargaming understands that, you know, to model a war game, to model a wartime or combat situation, you actually do need to have a lot of flexibility, right? You need to have, you know, people might want to do any number of things. Whether or not that is advisable or a good idea or possible is something else entirely. But I agree with
Napoleon's trying to shoot the ice out from under the Austrians at Austerlitz, and he finds the physics engine didn't model breakable ice. He's like, damn, fuck, this would have worked so well.
I didn't think of this. But yeah, I mean, I think what am I trying to say? You know, I've talked before about the two axes of tabletop players. There's the drama nerds, and then there's the, you know, wargamer engineers. But like, I actually think that the two are not as far apart as we might believe, because wargaming also requires a lot of narrative understanding, and even if there are like strict rules, you are still participating in a narrative creation, and I think that's important to bear in mind.
Let's see. Let's get into some specifics, because if you're listening to this episode, we're going to leave you with a lot of recommendations for things that you can try by yourself or with a small number or even a large number of friends. And I think, at least in my mind, because it happened within my like gaming lifetime, the departure of bringing back this kind of really narrative heavy rules starts with a game that was published by Games Workshop called Mordheim. And, you know, with the two of the designers, Rick Priestley and Tuomas Pirinen, have been like at the center of a lot of this and are even still making really interesting games. Mordheim is set in the Warhammer fantasy universe. So if you've played like Warhammer Total War, you're familiar with this kind of stuff. Set in the a city destroyed by a giant magic comet, where bands of like treasure hunters fight each other in the ruins, and your characters, as they go through, gain injuries, level up, and you can kind of, you know, play a quick casual game between you and another opponent, or you can play a longer campaign where you and your opponent decide to kind of craft a story as the game evolves, and there's a ton of rules for that. Now, this is a game that was published in 1999. The rules are, I would say, not that complicated, but they're also like not modern design rules. There's a lot of swinginess and rolling a single D6, and combats between characters can drag on forever. So, Rob, have you ever heard of Mordheim and this grim, dark stuff?
I am familiar with Mordheim. I haven't played it, but I've read through this before, and I'm reminded. I don't think I knew that it was published in 1999.
It was inspired by Y2K, according to the authors.
That's amazing. It is funny. The rules are definitely like crunchy, but
Oh yeah.
compared to, for example, Rogue Trader, which we just read, they're actually like relatively streamlined. Like Mordheim shows a lot of forward thinkingness in terms of design and functionality. Like it definitely is super. There's just like a lot, but it is. I don't know. In the 90s, we were still like, we're still in peak, 2E. So people, but games were crunch. Like crunch was the like default modes. This actually shows like some pretty advanced design thinking for the time period.
There's a lot of things in Mordheim that would not fly today. You kind of take your turn, and then the opponent takes their turn. So there's kind of a little bit of waiting, as opposed to a lot of modern miniature games kind of pass the turn back and forth, so you're never out of the action for more than 5 minutes. But because it's so simple in like the way most resolutions work, the games are in fact not that long. And it's really kind of a brutal game, right? You're set in kind of a Warhammer Fantasy is a real not 30 Years War Holy Roman Empire. You've got pistols and knights with big two-handed swords, but you also have like decrepit rat people and chaos mutants, holy sisters of the god Sigmar. And when you play the game, your characters get horrible injuries, but they also might discover like magic items and learn how to like cast spells and all of this stuff. And the game has been out of print for a long time, and normally I wouldn't recommend it, but there's so many third-party miniatures or 3D printing options that you can make a warband out of almost anything, and no one's going to, this is another hallmark of the narrative wargaming revolution, is to make games miniatures agnostic. Like, we don't care where your miniatures come from or what they look like, as long as you like them and I like them and it looks cool. And because the game is out of print and no longer supported by its original publisher, you can go to several different websites, linked to probably the best one in the show notes, to download all the rules you would need for a campaign, for building warbands. I and my friends have been playing a Mordheim campaign for over a year. I have a band of Amazons that is super cool. And yeah, it's super great. I've been telling a story about my Amazon warband trying to escape this city by getting enough gold and collecting warp stone that they can buy their passage back to their homeland in the West.
This is such a good point about the 3D printed miniatures. Obviously, if you want to spend money on the good ones, you can, and it's nice. They're really nice. But the barrier to entry to have like a pretty nice miniature or set of miniatures or models of any kind is so much lower than it used to be. There's, even if you know someone with a 3D printer, even better, but you can order them from all sorts of places online. They're not the greatest quality, but also they're not the worst. And This is a really cool thing, both for tabletop, but also for these types of narrative wargaming, where you don't theoretically need miniatures, but it's not really the same without them. But it makes it a lot more accessible. You still can't play like you still can't do like a Warhammer 40K battle without spending hundreds or thousands of dollars on like actual miniatures, but you can play a lot of these games without shelling out, more than, tens, 20s of dollars.
This is a great point, right? To play a game of like Warhammer Age of Sigmar or Warhammer 40K or any of these other big systems, you might need over 100 miniatures. You might be spending thousands of dollars and who knows how many hours if you want them all painted nicely. narrative war games, right, instead of you building a massive battle force, right, you're usually building one character, two characters, or a squad somewhere between 5 to 15, depending on the system and the like band that you create. So you're probably only making 6, 7, 8 miniatures. So you can spend a lot of time like making them like cool and look the way you want. And the money investment is no more than, you know, buying a set of role-playing game books, which is great, right? And yeah, I think Mordheim like really reignited this turn back to kind of the old narrative way by introducing, hey, back in 1880, people were doing narrative games, but with entire armies and forces. What if we just reduce this to a band of adventurers or a squad? Wouldn't that be much easier to handle? And the answer is yes.
This is one of those examples where tabletop, both like board games and RPGs, where development has been so much slower than in other forms of gaming. Like video games, I use this comparison a lot, are about the same age, younger often than tabletop or wargaming especially, but have extreme innovations in the last, 50, 60 years. And it feels like in many ways we're only starting to get that wave with tabletop and with narrative wargaming. Like it does seem obvious. Like I love squad-based combat, like to play as an idea. I do not love the idea of like, I don't know, if somebody did like a time lapse of a Warhammer 40K battle with like 100 miniatures on the board, that would be neat to me. I can't imagine like anything less fun than spending hours setting up and then
right. These games can take like 4 hours, you know?
But I love the idea of having like 6 to 10 little dudes who I am attached to. When I played with Matt, we played Kill Team. He had a team of orcs. I love every single one of them. They are my beautiful, ugly sons. I want to make a kill team of my own. But like it's perfect, right? And the game took an hour and a half, and I had never played before. Like it was the same type of play, but it was so much fun, so much faster, and so much more, I guess, like comprehensible. Like I was able to sort of like get the whole thing and experience all of it at once. I never felt like overwhelmed at any point. This seems like an obvious way to make the hobby, like there's room for both. Like you can have big set piece, gigantic battles of the Napoleonic or Warhammer 40K type, but also I think a lot of people don't have the time or patience or bandwidth for that. And having smaller squad-based combats is a lot of fun and a lot faster and an obvious innovation.
Yeah. So, in conclusion, if, you want to try one of the OG narrative games, Mordheim is a great option. All the rules are available online for free. No one will care what miniatures you have. In the like wider evolution of these games, Games Workshop was publishing many other narrative game systems around this time. Necromunda, set in Hive City in the Warhammer 40K universe, where different clans and houses in the decrepit like caverns under this city fight over scraps. They also made a really narrative-heavy game that has inspired a ton of other designers called Inquisitor, and it came with really big miniatures and didn't release a ton of models, but had a really detailed rules and was all about telling like a story, right? It's kind of the opposite of what most miniature games do today, which is all about like, hey, let's have a battle that is balanced between orcs and space elves. Inquisitor is like, hey, let's you tell a story as you do a campaign, and your character centered around an Inquisitor and his or her or their warband goes on. The game never really took off because these miniatures were didn't fit with the rest of the range, and people had trouble building them. But, people decided, hey, why don't I use my other regular size miniatures? These are often called heroic scale or 28 millimeter or 32 millimeter scale to play the same thing. And those people have been playing Inquisitor for a long time. On, let's see, I think the other side of the pond, right, moving over to America, the next game I want to bring to your attention, Rob, is by Joseph A. McCullough, and it's called Frostgrave, and very much inspired in this like Mordheim design of why don't we have two squads in a ruined area fighting each other over some kind of magical artifacts, or maybe in this game called Frostgrave, maybe they're not always exactly fighting, but they're in this area, and the best solution is to do some light skirmish, get the things you need, and get out. Or maybe you might even decide to team up as monsters appear in this ruined city. So Frostgrave set on like a ruined, icy necropolis, and you play a wizard, and your wizard has a band of retainers. And one of the cool things about this game is if you enjoy the character creation process that a lot of role-playing games, TTRPGs, provide, Frostgrave has that same kind of thing. You build a wizard, you choose like a primary school of wizardry and a secondary school, so you can be like a battle wizard, a sword mage, an illusionist, a necromancer, and there's all these like really general rules for hundreds of different spells that you can cast. And I've had a lot of fun playing Frostgrave. And there's some sequels. There are rules for playing by yourself that have been released. There's a ton of fan-made content. And just like, many other narrative games, it's essentially, there are official Frostgrave miniatures, but most people play with whatever miniatures they can get their hands on.
This brings us really interesting. Everything we've talked about so far has been, for lack of a better term, PvP. Player versus player.
Oh.
Also British.
Also British, yes.
Also a good point. But it has been, you are up against one or two, or, usually like player versus player. But this is, Frostgrave, actually I've not heard of PvP VE, player versus player, but also versus...
Absolutely.
But also there's some that we'll talk about in a bit that are purely player versus environment, right? Like you are all on the same team, and there's ways to randomly generate enemies, and so there's lots of different ways to approach this. I do think the one-on-one or the squad based is a lot of fun, but if you aren't as excited about playing against your friends, there actually are a lot of options where you might play together, which is one of the innovations, one of the cool and kind of obvious advancements that took a little while to come to the space.
Right. And Frostgrave, right, it is like by default player versus player, but there are so many scenarios where there are, essentially NPC enemies that have, clear rules for how to adjudicate them. So you don't need a game master. The game master is kind of built into the dice and cards of whatever system you're playing. Plus there's like pre-made narrative campaigns. So if you and your friends don't want to write, no one wants to be the referee and kind of write the story. Okay, here's the next scenario. You move into the tombs. There are skeletons here and the artifact, and this is what will happen when one of the teams acquires the artifact. If you don't want to write that yourself, other people, including the designer, other designers for the system, fans, have written full narrative campaigns for Frostgrave that can be multiple parts and will keep you and another friend entertained for years. So that's our second recommendation, I think, is Frostgrave by Joseph A. McCullough. It's in its second edition. We'll put a link in the show notes. And I think to build on that, and in the direction Rob was hinting at, another game by Joseph A. McCullough, which is, I think, my number one recommendation for this episode, is a game called Rangers of Shadowdeep. And unlike Frostgrave, which still has this kind of competitive element, Rangers of Shadowdeep is completely cooperative. You, as the player, are either by yourself, you can play this completely solo, or with 2 to 3 friends, or 1 friend is probably the ideal amount, right? You play Rangers and you go deal with a threat, you kill some monsters, the story evolves, your Rangers evolve and level up. Rangers of Shadowdeep.
Yeah, Matt introduced me to this for this episode, and it's real slick. It is a relatively brief book. It's well organized, and it's very clear. The rules and all of the charts and everything are nicely laid out. It seems very easy to jump into. It comes with a number of missions already. This is a real neat.
Plus, there are more mission books that you can buy.
Yeah, and it's like a little over 100 pages, and it seems like it'd be really easy to jump into and play and have lots to sink your teeth into. This is a very evolution of what we've been talking about so far.
So I think it's got like 2 cool things going for it. Is not only do you have the fun character building options, like you get to build your heroes, right? Just like you would build a D&D character. You can, pick their special abilities, pick their stats. And because it's a narrative game, like there's no one cares about balance or things like that. And if you're not sure how to adjudicate a rule, like the game's like, do whatever makes the most sense for the narrative, right? Or what will be the most fun.
This is a good point, and I don't want to dwell on it too much, but with the competitive ones, if we're talking about Mordheim or Kill Team, all the way up to the big ones, Warhammer 40K, balance matters a lot, right? People get upset, and reasonably so, if a figurine or a model is overpowered. It does not matter a whole lot in the PvE games, which we're going to talk about, which Rangers of Shadowdeep is one, but there are others, and I don't want to disparage the idea of balance, because I do think that it matters, and when you have a nicely balanced game, it's a lot of fun, but it can be stressful, and if you and your friends are likely to come to verbal or physical blows over whether or not, something is balanced or whether or not you've broken the rules, then these PvE games, it doesn't matter quite so much unless you've got something that's unbalanced that it's massively overshadowing everybody else. But that's a lot easier to balance.
You won't find that in Rangers of Shadowdeep. Nothing is massively wrong. And in a narrative game, right, you can just increase the challenge. My hero got really powerful with this combo of abilities. I'm going to put another giant spider in this adventure. Perfect. Rangers of Shadowdeep has, I think, it's gone through not a second edition, but just a revision. There's a revised copy. And the great thing is you can always just buy the PDFs, so you can print off anything you need, and you don't have to worry about an actual physical rule book. And the character creation in this is really fun. The character advancement is really fun. And while it has enough details where your characters can have cool abilities, the rules for adjudicating NPC monsters and your characters are really simple. It operates on a simple heroes go first, then monsters, then the heroes' retainers, which makes a really nice flow of combat where your heroes feel powerful, your retainers are still useful. The missions in the default book are fun and evocative, and there are hundreds of fan-made campaigns.
Speaking of, do I want to call this a recommendation? I'm gonna call it a recommendation. Speaking of in this vein, and also speaking of balance, one of my favorites is, let's start with there's 2 that I like that I'm throwing in as a novice, as an amateur, that don't hold a candle to Matt's, but I want to mention them because they are more mainstream and might be relevant to some of you. But those are Imperial Assault and Shadows of Brimstone. And Imperial Assault is a Star Wars game. It is published by Fantasy Flight, the last remaining Fantasy Flight game. It uses those fun dice that we have mentioned with different like pips on them, which indicate what you can do. And there are both, actually, no, that's not true. There's a lot of campaigns that you can run through, and there's an Imperial side and there's a Rebel side, and you can control a hero and go through several like extended campaigns and level up, and it's fun because it's Star Wars. I think there's a companion app. There used to be. This is something it's also like fun and easy to play with your friends. It has that feeling of development. It is, well, I guess we're talking about lots of things that are old. It feels old. It feels a little bit aged at 10 years in a way that I don't actually even think Mordheim does. And the other one that is beautiful trash that I just kind of want to like mention is Shadows Over Brimstone, which was a kickstarted maybe multiple times, maybe just once, kickstarted game about being a cowboy type in a frontier town that is exposed to Cthulhu monsters and weird warp stones that give you mutations. It is cool to me for a couple of reasons. One, I like the theme. And two, it's all randomly generated. All the tiles, all the terrain, you roll or you're given sort of like a set of instructions. And so each dungeon is different every time you run it. I think that this is well done. This is not like innovative anymore. There are lots of games that do this, but I think the way that it sort of helps you build a brand new layout every time you play is pretty neat. You develop as you go on. You often acquire mutations like tentacle arms and psychic powers and go crazy. It's very Cthulhu. You
can really see the DNA of Mordheim in this, right?
Yes.
Which has all the same mutations and warp stone and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the inspirations are obvious. If it's this, the only reason why you would pick this up, because it's also quite expensive to get all of the expansions and everything. But if you are more interested in sort of like a Wild West, a Weird West type of game, this is the one for you. But it was super popular, which is the only reason why I want to bring it up. You know, it broke out in a way that Mordheim never really has, maybe because of the big flashy Kickstarter campaign or the, Cthulhu monsters or something like that. It is a mess of a game, and the rules for most others are better. I do think it has some like neat innovations, though.
I think this would be games like Shadows Over Brimstone would be a great recommendation for any of our listeners who are not OSR pilled, right? So, right, you're trading the like, hey, these are loosey-goosey rule systems that will allow you to adjudicate many different actions. Whereas a game like Shadow Over Brimstone, what your character or characters can do is heavily prescribed, and the rules will have an answer for everything, and there's a lot of tight mechanisms of balance for each character and each monster that work really well for what it is, right? The trade-off is like, if you don't have the proprietary tiles and card decks and miniatures, you can't play it. Whereas a game like, Rangers over Shadowdeep, if you have the rules, any miniatures you can use are going to be fine. And I think for a lot of our listeners, right, if you have collected just some random miniatures, maybe even like pre-painted ones for monsters or heroes, you will have what you need to play for a game like Rangers over Shadowdeep or some other games that we're going to talk about. And you don't need anything else. And hey, maybe for the monsters, because you're only going to use them one time, you're going to print out cards and put them into little stands, and that'll be your monster things. And you only have bespoke miniatures for your heroes, right? So that's the trade-off. But again, like for Shadows Over Brimstone, it's a finely tuned campaign, right? Where you will not have to worry about any fiddliness because it is not OSR. It's the 4E of narrative wargaming.
This is a great point, Matt, and the OSR comparison is a good one because something like Mordheim or Rangers of Shadowdeep are a little bit more DIY in like a good way. Like this is what we love about OSR is that you have all the pieces that you need. It's a little bit more assembly required. There's a little bit more fuzziness around the edges, a little bit more interpretation around the rules. But for someone like me or for Matt, increasingly, I think that we know what we're doing and we like the flexibility that allows. But something that's nice about exactly like in the tabletop space, 4E, or in the board game space, something like Shadows of Brimstone, is everything's in the box, right? Everything that you need is right there. And that is valuable for a lot of people. And it's nice to be able to sort of like pick up and play without having to do a whole lot of like putting stuff together. But if you are leaning towards that sort of OSR, do a little bit of it yourself, and you're willing to put in the effort, that is, I think, what is so cool about, I guess like I feel the same way about narrative wargaming as I do about OSR. It's cool that there are so many people working in this space. There's so many creative people doing stuff themselves. There's so many third-party and just sort of like free bonus content and supplemental options. But yeah, if you're not as excited about that, there are other options. The sort of like, we'll probably talk about this separately, but like sort of the ultimate of this is Gloomhaven, which I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with, which is literally everything in a box, but it is a very big, expensive box, and it's its own beast.
Right. Rangers of Shadowdeep, especially if you already have a handful of miniatures, or the cost is going to be $20 for the PDF of the rulebook, right? I don't know what the cost of Gloomhaven is. I'm sure it is.
It's like $200, I think.
Okay.
I haven't looked. I haven't looked recently, but like that's last time I like looked into buying it. It's which is, by the way, a little bit more than the cost of buying all 3 D&D books, right? Like it's a lot of money, but if like your group chips in to get it and you all play it together, that's not like, the point I'm trying to make here is like, I don't think it's overpriced. However, it is expensive. If you don't have $200, it doesn't matter that it's like worth it. It's a lot of money.
A couple other so Rangers over Shadowdeep is very classic fantasy, right? You got swords, you got bows and arrows, you got spells. What if like just classic fantasy is not your jam? Modiphius publishes 5 Parsecs from Home, a solo or cooperative narrative miniatures agnostic war game. It is super fun. It's got a great sci-fi feel. There's rules for, okay, you go from this planet to this planet and we're going to land and do this mission. And, you can kind of make those fun decisions. There's also Frostgrave if you want a co-op or competitive sci-fi game. Joseph A. McCullough also published quite recently Silver Bayonet if you are one of those people who loves Napoleonic miniatures and you have a bunch of them. What if you wanted to hunt werewolves with your, Sharps Rifles miniatures or Imperial Grenadiers? This is a fun narrative campaign using those rules. Even Battletech, which has some of the most extensive campaign rules of any game ever made. If you want to run a mercenary company and track all of your C-bills and credits, it has rules for that. But they also released some kind of really quick play solo or cooperative rules called Battletech Alpha Strike Aces. It's still in beta, but I've played a couple games by myself and a couple games with a friend, and it's super fun if you want giant robot cooperative games. So those are just some other quick recommendations if you don't like fantasy stuff.
And this reminds me that like my go-to example is always XCOM, but like Battletech, the Battletech video game, is also like exactly that kind of tactical, procedurally generated, narrative, emergent gameplay type of game, which is amazing. One of my favorites. And also Battletech is just like a rich field for this. And Matt is obviously a fan. We're both huge fans, but yeah, this tactical gameplay, really like there's lots of options here. I'm excited I also just found out about this from Matt for this episode, but I am excited about this Battletech Aces. Looks really neat.
Yeah, it uses a kind of really, I wouldn't say innovative, but borrowing from a lot of things where the NPC enemies that your mercenary company or other force might be up against have little decks of cards that you can print off, and you flip them over to see what type of action they take against you. And this is super fun if you like BattleTech. It's actually just like playing the BattleTech tactical video game, if anyone's ever played that. And I think the advantage that, for example, Rangers of Shadowdeep might have over XCOM, or BattleTech Aces might have over the BattleTech video game, is you have to do some of the narrative work. If you want to like create your own story, you have so much more freedom than in a video game. And if you want to practice like, hey, telling a narrative story through play, one of these solo or cooperative games, I think, is great fodder for your game master, dungeon master brain.
Yeah, sorry, we didn't open with this, but like even if this isn't your thing especially, I do think there's a lot to be learned from these types of games that can be applied to GMing any type of game. I think there's a lot of tools and a lot that you'll learn and pick up from running these that can be applied, especially if you are playing something like D&D, which has tactical or wargaming roots. But even if you don't, like, that's the obvious application. But even if it's not what you're playing, I still think there's a lot to be learned from these types of games.
I think our next recommendation is one I would absolutely recommend if you have people who are not familiar with wargaming at all and really want something incredibly simple, and that's the one-page rules system. All of the rules for one-page rules are available online, and the basic rules all fit on one page, front and back. So very simple, very straightforward. Of course, there's a longer section of rules, which still only runs like 15 or 20 pages that you can read if you want more detail on how to do things. And if it's your first time playing, you might want to do that. The game is completely miniatures agnostic. The company makes its money by selling hardcover books, the lore, and prints or plastic of miniatures that come with the systems. But again, there should feel no obligation to use these. And there are rules in the one-page rule system for giant fantasy battles, giant space battles, squad-based fantasy player versus player, same for sci-fi. But they've also just released one-page rules Fantasy Quest, which is a solo or cooperative system for running missions, and has rules for how NPCs work and for you to tell your own story. The rules are very straightforward and simple. Any sort of fantasy hero that you want to build is available. If you want to be a bunch of like lizard folk heroes fighting humans, you can do that. If you want to be regular humans doing whatever, you can do that as well. These rules just came out, and I think they're going to get a lot of play just because of their accessibility. There's a character builder online or in an app. And if you don't want to use that, printing off your character sheet is also super, super easy.
I think a really neat thing about a lot of these, I guess this goes back to like the OSR thing we were talking about, but the flexibility, right? Like both the ones that allow you to play solo up to like a certain number of players that, have PvP or PvE options. Like I think it's really neat that these are adaptable to your circumstances. I am personally excited to try out some of the solo adventure or solo games to see if I like them enough to, adapt them for play with my my players or something like that.
Right. The great thing about solo is try it yourself.
Yeah.
See if it's fun. If not, you didn't waste any of your friends' time. If it was super fun, invite that one friend who will always come on role-playing name night when it's, okay, we're down to... See, this is our point here. Is like, if you're going to have your D&D game and 5 people were supposed to show up and only one does, or only one can make it, say, all right, well, we're not playing D&D tonight, but you and me are going to play... we're going to play Rangers over Shadowdeep. We're going to play Age of Fantasy Quest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is just really cool. I mean, if you've got a group that all 6 of you show up every single Thursday or Wednesday or whatever, like, well, why are you listening to this podcast?
Who are you?
Yeah, you don't need any help. But if you're like a lot of us, a lot of our listeners, and you have players, but you don't always have a whole group, these are great options that allow you to continue to have the feel of a role-playing game and, hone your chops, but also, you don't have to sort of scramble to adapt if you suddenly don't have enough players for your regular game.
Yeah. I also think narrative wargaming is great practice for your GM brain in creating interesting scenarios, right?
Yeah.
Especially like combat scenarios, because as we know, role-playing games, most of them draw a lot of their, how combat should work straight from wargaming. So practicing making interesting wargaming narrative scenarios will help you make interesting combat TTRPG scenarios.
Yeah, and this is... how much this matters depends on you and your group, but I as somebody who still runs a lot of D&D or OSR games, I don't make every single combat, a huge set piece battle, but I do love when it matters to have a lot of like dynamic, interesting things happening, terrain and elevation and battlefield effects and unique combinations of enemies, casters and ranged and guys up front. And playing narrative war games really helps you, gives you practice in designing those types of interesting scenarios because they're built around that and it comes sort of like pre-packaged. And I think that can be really, really valuable for any sort of tabletop that involves combat.
Okay, I think if we should talk about any other games that we're excited about, just as recommendations for our listeners.
Matt is prompting me to talk about something that I'm really excited about.
I've got one that I've been excited about for the past year, and so we talked a lot about narrative games, and I think there is some that have a foot in both worlds. Warhammer Kill Team, published by Games Workshop, came out with a new edition in 2021. The rules are, very balanced compared to other narrative games. They're very tight. The game plays fast. It's very exciting. It is competitive, right? Squad versus squad. You don't need a lot of miniatures. The game is... So I think the difference between this game and other games is this game is incredibly well supported, right? New teams are released every couple months. There's tons of rules for new terrain, new missions, and new scenarios. And that's what you get when you get a game that is competitive, because there are a lot of competitive war gamers, right? Like Warhammer 40K or Age of Sigmar. There's not 1,000 miniatures released every year for Rangers over Shadowdeep because it's miniatures agnostic and not that many people play it. But lots of people play Kill Team, so there's a lot of miniatures for it. However, Kill Team also has a narrative set of rules, and while they're not as developed as Rangers over Shadowdeep, your players or your characters on your team can still get injuries, experience, level up, that kind of thing. And if you're a creative referee for you and your friends playing this game, you can create a really awesome narrative arcs for your players or for you and your friends to tell a story. And that's something I've been doing for the past couple of years, and I've had a lot of fun doing it. So that's my last recommendation is Kill Team. If you want to dip into the competitive area just a little bit and you really care about the actual gameplay experience a little more than something like Rangers over Shadowdeep. But then we can get to the one we really want to talk about.
Well, no, I actually want to echo Matt on Kill Team because, like I said, I spoiled this because, I played this with Matt, and it's the most fun I've ever had in a narrative war game. Like I said, I played a team of orc. I've already forgot what they're called because I'm not
orc commandos.
Commandos the K. Sorry, I fucking love my orcs. And it was so much fun. I got really attached to my crazy little dudes, and it was really easy to jump into, and it was really easy to figure out. If you're like me and you are vaguely interested in the ideas and aesthetics and vibe of Warhammer 40K, but you balk at the idea of an army, this is the first time that I have ever felt compelled to purchase a Warhammer 40K product. I still might get my own kill team because I think it's neat and it would be fun to have. I would enjoy having exactly 6 to 10 guys. Like, I don't want any more than that. I live in Oregon, right? Matt's in Texas. Our houses are smaller here. I do not have space for any more miniatures in my house.
Wait, you don't have your own miniature room?
I don't. But I could find room for a kill team. So this is if you have it does cost money, but if you are looking to, I agree with Matt. I think this is really like the cutting edge of this type of play, and it lends itself to either one-off battles or like extended campaigns with like a narrative element. I think you could do either really, really easily. I think it's super neat.
Warhammer or Games Workshop makes a fantasy version of this that's I would say actually a little bit different, but kind of similar, called Warcry. It is not as well supported as Kill Team. I'm guessing just because like 40K is more popular than their fantasy line. But if you're interested in that, Warcry, I've played one game of it. It is super fast and easy to learn, and a great competitive / game that has a little bit of narrative flavor.
I also like to be clear. We played a whole game of this in like an hour, and I had never played the game before. That is faster than a game of Everdell or like Wingspan. Like it is quick.
I really wish there was a cyberpunk one of these that was good. I've read through a little bit of Reality's Edge, but I just did not like the rules system. But maybe one day someone will create a really cool narrative cyberpunk solo game.
That is interesting. That is definitely like a gap that exists.
But a gap that does not exist, going back to our Mordheim favorites, going back to Tuomas, Pirinin. What do we got?
And Mike Francina.
One of your favorite artists.
Just a classic fantasy artist. Is working with Thomas Pirinin and a bunch of other notables on it's not even released yet. They're going to do a Kickstarter later this year, but a new miniatures board game very much inspired by Mordheim and Warhammer Fantasy called Trench Crusade, which is, there are playtest rules. You should look it up. You should sign up for the Kickstarter.
Link in the show notes.
But it's less that I'm excited about the rules or the gameplay, though I am. But like the idea is that there's just like a crusade against hell, and they've cloned the Messiah to create horrible like
paladins,
paladin golems,
Metachrists,
Metachrists, and you've got like guys with big flamethrowers, but there's helmet. They've got like bucket helms like they're knights. It's just like the vibes are immaculate. It's very metal. It's pretty gross, but I think that it's gonna be super awesome when it comes out. And
what if we combined World War I with the Crusades and fantasy heavy metal hell?
It's got like some similar like art vibes to Scythe, which we love, which is it's
but way more brutal, way more bloody,
more brutal.
way more R-rated.
Sorry, don't look at this when your kids are in the room if you've got them. But it's really cool. I think this is going to be, a lot of people are like very excited about this. It's got a lot of buzz online.
And I would say,
yeah.
speaking of this crossover between TTRPGs and this revival of narrative wargaming, this is the designer who created Mordheim, but like we have, I think, a really fun, fast dice system that kind of draws a little bit really quick, from Powered by the Apocalypse, where you're almost always rolling 2d6. There's a range of outcomes, so it feels like every action has some kind of effect. And then you're either based on this character's special abilities, adding or subtracting dice to that combat. So there's a lot less fiddliness of tracking numbers. Damage just becomes chips next to your character that your opponent can spin to give you penalties. Like, what a cool, I think it's not only artistically innovative with World War I versus hell and demons, but it's got a great set of innovations in rules.
Yeah, there's a good amount of crunch. You still like have rulers and that's you might need, but like, the rolls, it's just 2d6. Yeah, risky, success, failure, critical success, a little bit of, modifiers in either direction, some tokens that are very cool that allow you to do things or allow your opponents to do things, simple movement and action rules. I think that there's a lot of innovation in the actual gameplay of this that will make this, I'm expecting this to be great, but I'm also expecting that this will spawn a lot of hacks and spin-offs because based on the core rules, because I think they're really good. I think they capture the feel of that narrative wargaming without the you don't have to
go
firing
to
at each other crunch,
right. A chart to look up did I hit or not, right? Yeah. Which is a hallmark of Mordheim and other games. And it's also, in that firm kind of OSR for narrative wargaming, like it is miniature agnostic. You are encouraged to kit bash and use whatever you've got, use paper tokens if you don't have it, create fun terrain. I think a lot of the ideas from this, or at least some of the people who are fans of this, come from there's a magazine that if people are interested in like getting inspirations, reading about rules design for narrative wargaming, about art, about miniature creation, is to check out 28 magazine. It's free, it's punk, it's anti-capitalist. It's a cool magazine for people really into grimdark miniature wargaming.
It's a zine. And like the classic,
It's a great zine. Quarterly released. Highly recommend 28 magazine. But yeah, no, Trench Crusade looks really great. I'm already like collecting parts to build my Antioch guys in power armor with like Browning machine guns strapped to their arms and trench pilgrims carrying giant tombstones and crosses.
There's a faction that's like, the Iron Sultanate, which just, just picture in your mind what that makes you think of. Like, I'm so excited about all of this. Yeah.
Listen, if you are someone who likes miniatures for your TTRPGs and you like, telling an emerging story where you don't know what's going to happen, but you got some loose guidelines for things, I think narrative miniature gaming is something you should try out. It can expand your horizons as a game master and give you something to do when you're by yourself and you want a game and you can't get everyone together, or you can just get one or two people together.
Yeah, this is, part of a long arc that we've been talking about, but like I find that these types of games are very, very pleasant when I am feeling overwhelmed or, kind of burned out on my narrative heavy campaigns, which most of them are. And it's just very nice to have a lot of the decisions made for you, and also sort of like you as the GM or you as the player play to find out what happens based on randomness or, your encounters with whatever's on the board. It's a nice break. It's a good way to sort of like, excuse me, remind yourself why this stuff is fun, and without like so much pressure on you as GM to do all the thinking and planning and narrative work.
And we've just touched the surface of this movement in gaming. We didn't talk about Forbidden Psalm, which is inspired by Morkborg or uses a lot of Morkborg rules. There are so many.
Oh yeah,
others that people
that one's really
could,
exciting.
could
I've only
do.
looked at that briefly. I forgot about that. Morkborg is obviously like a perfect, companion to this type of thing. And yeah, I forgot that they had made some miniatures for that. A miniature war game for that, which is perfect.
Perfect. So crack open your paints, get ready to express your creative side, or don't, right? Print off cool art and put it into stands. Do it however you want. It's DIY, it's punk, it's narrative wargaming. And Rob, if you like this episode, hey, you can get some more episodes of our show on patreon.com/
That's right.
Dungeon Master of None.
Check out our Patreon. Subscribe to the podcast, like, review, tell your friends about it, join our Discord. If you have questions or thoughts, you can always email us at dmofnone@gmail.com, add us on Twitter at dmofnone, and whatever you do,
Moving those miniatures around.
keep rolling those dice and moving those miniatures around.